Okay, this is the second session in the Organisational Resilience and Reliability module, in which I'll be introducing the concepts of resilience and reliability in their own right. Okay, so last time I talked about risk and risk in organisations and the distinction between risk and uncertainty. Now I'm getting on to resilience and reliability as a way of understanding the response an organisation can make to risk. Okay, so I started by having a little discussion around Hurricane Katrina, and its effect on New Orleans. The reason being that in 2015, 10 years after Katrina had struck New Orleans and devastated the city had become a renewed place where people wanted to live and people wanted to go, and they called New Orleans resilient. What do they mean by resilient? Let's think about what that means. So, what is resilience? Well, here's a reference from Walker, Holling and Carpenter and Kinzig in the journal Ecology and Society. They call resilience the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganise while undergoing change, so as to retain essentially the same function, structure, identity and feedback. There are a couple of things there to point out. It's the capacity of a system. So what they're talking about is systems. So I'm going to think a little bit about what we mean by systems. Those systems, or that system, undergoes a disturbance. Something affects it, something impacts upon it. It has to reorganise itself to contain or deal with that disturbance whilst still being able to carry on in the same, more or less the same, function, structure, identity. So let's think about a system. A system can be defined as a set of interrelated parts that we experience as a whole. While we may be able to observe and bump into these parts, their systemicity is different to a thing out there. What S. Berger and Reyes mean by this is that organisations, or anything really, which any entity which exists, contain or comprises parts, and those parts work together in order to enable the thing to do what it does. Okay, so but the way those parts work together isn't in and of itself necessarily observable. It is just the nature of those parts being together that creates what it is. So let's think about that as an example. Here we have a pile of rocks. Here we have a wall made from those potentially same rocks. The pile of rocks has no system, it is just a pile of rocks. They could be scattered around, they could be piled up, but they have no real sense of purpose beyond being a pile of rocks. The wall is made of rocks, and it has a purpose. It's a system in its own right, in that the wall has structure and a sense, but also it has a purpose in that it divides two pieces of land. So it is more than a mere collection of parts. Okay, so let's think about this a bit more. In terms of understanding systems, a system is a set of elements that interact together and create merging properties as a whole. So, systems exhibit behaviour, they have functionality, they have purpose. Groups of elements within a system may themselves have similar properties. In other words, systems are formed of subsystems. So a system could be part of a number of other systems which all work together to create an overall much larger system, which itself may be part of a much larger system. Think of an airport. An airport has lots of different activities going on there which are themselves systems. For example, baggage handling. You go into an airport, take your bag to check in, put your bag onto the weighing machine, and then it just disappears off down into the bowels of the airport. What it's doing is going into the baggage handling system. That baggage handling system is itself part of the wider system, which is the airport, and part of the much wider system, which is the air transport system. Okay, the systems exist within a given context or environment. They are clearly delineated, in other words, have a boundary, and interacts with the environment to produce inputs and outputs, source inputs and produce outputs. Systems can be identified by a stakeholder to be of interest. In other words, they have purpose. Okay, let's think about organisations and resilience. So first of all, in terms of resilience, I want to think about where resilience comes from and where it's applied. So resilience can be thought of in terms of engineering. A piece of material might be flexible and be able to be resilient in terms of shocks to the piece of material and retake its original form, or might be scratch proof or bulletproof or whatever. In terms of ecology, the environment recovering from damage of one sort or another. I'll come back to that in a moment. Psychology, individuals recovering from setbacks and dealing with crises. And sociology, which we're interested in, which is about organisations primarily. So, here's a number of words: sustainability, vulnerability, mitigation, reconstruction, persistence, adaptation, resistance, recovery, learning, absorption, and all these are related to in one way or another, words which can relate to the concept of resilience. Now, what they've done in this paper in the European Journal of Geography is take these words and group them into categories which relate to resilience in different contexts. So in this one they've got those three words relating to climate change. Over there we've got economy. Over there we've got the ecology. Over there we've got materials. Over there we've got psychology. Here we have organisational science. And encompassing everything is what I talked about last time, which is risk. Okay. So in terms of resilience, the best way of thinking about it is a infinity curve, or a figure of 8 on its side, which is the infinity. What we have here are 4 phases. We start with exploitation down in the box R. The way to think about this is to use a metaphor. The metaphor I'll use is a forest. So a new forest begins to take root in a piece of barren land, say. And so trees start to grow, the ecosystem starts to develop. What the forest is doing is exploiting its environment and growing, creating food, using food, drawing sun and oxygen to enable the trees to grow bigger and stronger and create a broad, detailed ecosystem. As that happens, it gets into the phase which is called conservation. Conservation is about the system, which is the forest in this case, being established, being creating and growing and being persistent. This phase, conservation phase, which is in K, can last, or kappa, can last for a sustained period of time. Nothing may happen to the forest. Nothing may happen to the system. Suddenly, there's some sort of crisis. The crisis could be, for example, in the case of a forest fire. Forest fire sweeps through the forest, clears out, destroys all the dead wood, and what we have is a release, and then the forest has to reorganise. It starts to recover. The new trees start to grow, and it moves back into, so that's in, so we go on to omega, then we go to alpha, then we go back into the R part of the diagram, exploitation again. And so we go through the whole cycle again. And this is how systems work. They begin, they have a beginning point, they grow, they become established, and then something happens which may threaten the system, then it recovers. It recovers, particularly in natural systems, they recover, and then they again go through the whole process again. Now, imagine that same forest, and imagine that bulldozers came in, swept away all the trees, swept away the entire ecosystem. There was no opportunity to recover, and the land was used for farming. Then we go into X, where there is no recovery, the cycle is broken, and something else happens, a new thing happens. In this case, it might be farmland. Okay? So that's resilience. Now let's think about organisational resilience. So we have organisations, they begin as small businesses or small activities, they grow, they become established, something happens to them maybe after a year, maybe after 10 years, maybe after 50 years, maybe after 100 years, and something impacts an organisation which could threaten it. Will it recover? So organisational resilience, I've underlined the organisation there, is the maintenance of positive adjustment under challenging conditions, such that the organisation emerges from those conditions strengthened and more resourceful. In other words, it's not just recovering, bouncing back, it's about absorbing the challenging conditions, coping with them, and coming out of the challenging situation stronger and in a more competitive position. Vogels and Sutcliffe wrote this paper, Organisational Resilience, which was presented at the conference Man and Cybernetics in 2007. And Vogels and Sutcliffe are both key writers in the field of organisational resilience. So, what is resilience and what isn't it? Organisational resilience is not about responding to one-term crises. It's not about a crisis happening to an organisation and it recovering and then going on. It's more than just rebounding from a setback. It's about a pervading culture, a pervading set of structures within the organisation that enable it to persist through crisis after crisis after crisis. What it is continuously anticipating and adjusting to what Hammond and Valikangas call deep secular trends that can permanently impair the earning power of a core business. It's about having the capacity to change before the case of change becomes desperately obvious. Some issues with organisational resilience. It's hard to get good at something which you don't have much practice in. So, crisis in organisations doesn't happen all the time. A big crisis might happen once a year, once 10 years, once every 100 years, who knows? If you don't have continual setbacks, continual crisis, how can you ever become good at it? Good at being resilient and coping with that crisis? Are we just concerned with survival in a world of uncertainty, or are we more interested in growing and learning from crisis and becoming an organisation which is stronger and better going into the future? Or do we want to thrive in a world of uncertainty? Do you want to see the uncertainty around us as a means, as an opportunity, rather than a threat? Here's some questions. Is resilience context specific? No one knows. Some organisations seem to be resilient and in some circumstances, but not others. No one really knows, and no one's been able to answer the question, is resilience context specific? Can resilience be measured? Or is it a vague, fuzzy thing that's hard to understand? No one has really satisfactorily measured resilience. We can look at organisations and say, well, this seems to be resilient because of certain things. We can measure how long an organisation's persisted under a condition of threat or crisis. But is that a clear and precise and objective measure of resilience? Don't know. There's no real answer to that. What are the implications of these questions for generalising to other organisations? This is a big problem. So we talk about resilience, and I will talk about resilience throughout this module. And I will suggest some ideas and theories and concepts which could be applied within organisations to possibly make them more resilient. But maybe it won't make them resilient, because we don't know whether these ideas and concepts can satisfactorily be generalised. How do you judge resilience? You can't just wait for a disaster to happen and find out, said Stevenson, Vargo and Seville. Can't just look at the inputs. Some organisations that don't plan actually perform very well during a crisis, they noticed, and smaller organisations tend to do very well with little planning, and despite this can do very well in times of crisis. George Anders from the Wall Street Journal has talked about organisational resilience. He had this nice quote: the resilient enterprise is more than a grab bag of stories about fires, thieves and tornadoes. It is a timely analysis of an important and overlooked aspect of business strategy. That's an important point. For Anders, and I think for me as well, organisational resilience is not just about stuff which happens, which just is going on in various places. It's about a strategic approach to running an organisation. Okay, so it's understanding what resilience is, as I just discussed, understanding that organisations are systems which need to be resilient, and then understanding that in order to be resilient, you need to think about this at a strategic level. It's enacted at an operational level, but it's thought of and enabled at a strategic level. Okay, so I talked a bit about digital disruption. This is really returning to the sense that life for organisations is uncertain. All organisations face disruption. Taxi companies all around the world are being threatened by the largest taxi company, which owns no taxis, which is Uber. Accommodation, hotels. At one time we would have thought, well, hotels are hotels. You want to go somewhere and travel somewhere, you stay at a hotel. This is no longer the most obvious, or maybe the most obvious, but no longer the only option available to people. The largest accommodation provider owns no real estate, Airbnb. Phone companies. We rely on our phones for communication. The largest phone companies own no telecoms infrastructure, such as Skype, WeChat, so forth. The world's most valuable retailers have no infrastructure. So we think about retailers, we go to the shops and buy things, we go to city centres and buy things. Well, city centres are systems, and city centres have shops and restaurants and so forth. Well, if the shops all disappear, what happens to the city centres? Are they going to be resilient? That's a good question, I think. Organisations like eBay and Alibaba, all they do is they facilitate peer-to-peer retail, or organisations retailing to large groups of consumers. The most popular media owners create no content, like YouTube and Facebook. The fastest growing banks have no actual money, Society One. The world's largest movie house owns no cinemas. The world's largest movie house is now Netflix. What does that mean for cinema chains? The largest software operators don't write apps. The likes of Apple and Google, they write almost no apps. They write the operating system, and then people, the wider community of app producers, write apps which can be loaded onto Apple and Google and other platforms. Okay, another way of looking at this is that what organisations are going through is technological discontinuity. Now, you can have competitive enhancing innovations and competitive destroying innovations. So we have all technologies experience innovations which create variation in that technology. And all organisations have to cope with this continual variation. Now, competitive enhancing innovations make slight adjustments, slight changes to the dominant design, to the architecture of the technology, or in terms of how it's marketed or how the market perceives the technology. That's incremental change. Little changes just happening all the time, which don't change the way people see technology, but do change the way that technology might interact with the consumer base. Every now and again, there's an era of ferment. The dominant design is swept away, or all design is swept away, all the technology is swept away, and something substitutes it. And what we have in both cases is a selection and dominant design taking root, which becomes the new status quo, which then is subject to continuous variation through incremental change, until eventually another era of ferment will happen, and that dominant design will be swept away and something new will come along. And I talked about the example of cameras. So at one time, everyone had film cameras, then we all had digital cameras. Now, very few people really use cameras. The camera market's virtually disappeared. It's become a specialist niche thing, and everyone has a camera in their phone. And for a long time, digital technology was held back by Kodak, who invented the digital technology. They sat on it because what they were doing was making huge amounts of money from selling film for film cameras. Okay, so let's think about the resilient organisation a bit more. So what is resilience? Resilience is both strategic and operational. As I said earlier, it's enacted operationally but enabled strategically. It's both structural and cultural. It's about systems and processes put in place within an organisation, but it's also about the way people within an organisation behave, see one another and work together. Resilience is behavioural and systemic. So it's about having systems in place, but it's also about how people interact with those systems. It's about processes and a state of mind. It's about having processes which enable things to happen, and it's about a state of mind. It's about the way people cognitively understand those processes. Okay, so then I want to talk about two key theories which underpin organisational resilience. The first one is normal accident theory, sometimes called normal systems theory. And the second one is called high reliability organisational theory, often abbreviated as HRO theory. So we have NAT and HRO theories. These two pictures, the first one is a Challenger disaster, the second one is 3 Mile Island. There are lots of other examples which have been used to support normal accident theory. So what is normal accident theory? The exemplars are things like 3 Mile Island, NASA and Challenger disasters. A key writer, a key author in this field is Charles Perrow. And he said, normal systems are characterized as, or we can think about an organisation as a system, and system accidents are an inevitability. At some point, all systems, no matter what they are, organisational systems I should say, no matter what they are, will run into some sort of problem. This is a result of interactive complexity. In other words, large systems are incredibly complex. No single person can understand a system. You don't know how the systems and subsystems interact, and also of tight coupling of processes or over-tight coupling, so that if one process is impacted, everything is impacted, because everything is reliant on one or two processes. Everything is reliant on the process that happens before it, and processes after it are reliant on that one. Okay. The other thing is, because of interactive complexity and because of over-tight coupling, there are system vulnerabilities and structural dependencies that no one can understand. No one understands them, no one can see them, no one's even thought about them. In many respects, what Perrow and Sagan are saying is that organisations are full of both internal uncertainty and external uncertainty, which is impacting upon those organisations, and that because of their complexity and because of tight coupling, ultimately disaster is inevitable. At some point along the history of an organisation, disaster is inevitable. Okay, I'll talk briefly about James Reeson's 3-bucket foresight model, which is a way of overcoming or challenging this viewpoint. So he talks about self. You fill up the self with understanding. You understand yourself and your role in an organisation. You understand your context. You understand how you fit into the wider environment. And then you understand your task. What are you doing? If you can understand these three things in terms of the self and in terms of the organisation, then you can start to understand what's going on in terms of your system as an organisation. And then if you understand the system, you can start to break down that over-tight coupling. You can start to reduce the interactive complexity. So a question: where is the most dangerous workplace in the world? There's lots of different dangerous workplaces. The one which is used by high reliability theory organisational theorists is the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. A very complex, difficult place to operate. So let's think about high reliability organisations. Exemplars used are aircraft carriers, air traffic control, nuclear power stations. These are systems, highly complex systems, which, were there to be a failure, some or many people would die. If the failure happens, that failure is catastrophic. And these are systems which operate over and over and over again with many possibilities of failure, but there's no failure happening in these organisations. Okay? Writers in this field are, in particular, Carl Weick and colleagues, but also Laporte and other people. High reliability organisations are characterised, in contrast to normal accident theory, by low levels of interaction complexity, by decoupled systems. Mistakes, when they are made, if they are made, are visible and tackled. They are stable systems with inbuilt processes and full awareness of how the system works. So a lot of time and effort in these organisations is spent understanding the nature of the system. Okay, so high reliability theory is important and an underpinning of resilience. Okay, so I've got the characteristics of high reliability theory organisations here, and you'll notice that this is from a book by Carl Weick and Karen Sutcliffe called Managing the Unexpected: Resilient Performance in the Age of Uncertainty. It really sums up what I'm going to talk about, or I've been talking about over the last 2 sessions. So high reliability organisations are characterised by 1, a preoccupation with failure, 2, a reluctance to simplify interpretations, 3, a sensitivity to operations, 4, a commitment to resilience, and 5, deference to expertise. What I'm going to do is take you briefly through each one of these. So, what do we mean by preoccupation of failure? With this characteristic, everyone in the organisation is focused on errors and near misses, looking for them all the time. If an error happens, then people are alert to the error, pick it up very early on, spot early weak signals, and look out for them, and then when they've noticed them, try to learn from them and figure out how to prevent them from happening in the future. So preoccupation is about learning. It's about noticing and then learning. High reliability organisations destigmatise failure. By that it means that if something goes wrong, if you make a mistake or someone in the system makes a mistake, you aren't castigated for it. It's rather regarded as an opportunity to learn so that mistake can't happen again. There's a sense of shared attentiveness across the organisation at an operational level, and this attentiveness has to be constant. In terms of reluctance to simplify, what are we talking about here? Well, really, the problem here lies in trying to find the easy answers. So, reluctance to simplify is about constantly asking why things are happening and inviting diverse opinions and diverse experience to express their opinions. So it's asking for multiple opinions, multiple people to be involved in trying to understand the system and trying to understand what's going on, trying to understand mistakes and failures, threats and problems, and always asking why what's happening is happening, never going to the simple answer. This is about avoiding broad, rational excuses and digging deeper and trying to understand more deeply what's going on. And I'll really tackle this problem over the next few sessions. It's about sensitivity to operations. So it's about sensitivity to what's going on at the front line, at the coalface within an organisation. It involves closing loopholes in processes so that processes don't fail. It involves maintaining situational awareness, understanding what's going on in context. Think about James Reason and his issue around context and task. It involves developing teams that speak up and pay attention to the front line. Teams who work together, help each other, support each other. Each employee within an organisation who is operational pays close attention to the operations and maintains awareness of what is and what isn't working, and is not afraid to report that up to their peers and to their superiors along the hierarchy. There are no assumptions. So it's very easy to become complacent and relax and assume everything's fine. Sensitivity to operations means removing assumptions. Next, we have commitment to resilience. So we're assuming resilience, but then we have to have a commitment to ensuring that resilience continues. This is the concept that things will go wrong, that we can't predict. Mistakes will be made. We will get into trouble. So in some ways, it is allied to normal accident theory. It understands that mistakes will be made. But then if you have the other things in place, those mistakes won't destroy the operation, won't create massive disaster. Okay? It's because operations have a quick identification of issues. Structures are in place for immediate response rather than slow response, which can minimize harm. It's sometimes called relentlessness. It's about continual attention to everything that could possibly go wrong, always looking out for mistakes, always looking out for error. As you can imagine, this imposes a lot of stress on people working in high reliability organisations. Finally, we have deference to expertise. It means breaking down hierarchies. So this is about recognising that those who are closest to the front line are the experts and empowering them to make decisions when critical issues arise. So, for example, on the aircraft carrier flight deck, when an aircraft is coming into land, the person bringing the aircraft into land has total control over the whole system. They can stop the aircraft landing, they can ask it to go away and come back again, they can clear the flight deck, they can do all sorts. They have a lot of power in that particular situation. The individuals might not have the most seniority, but they are still encouraged to voice their concerns, ideas and input, regardless of hierarchy. Okay, so I've talked about the 5 characteristics of high reliability organisations. What about the key principles under which they operate? So we have 4 here: prioritisation of safety and performance and shared organisational goals, a promotion of a culture of reliability, emphasis on organisational learning, and extensive use of redundancy. This is sometimes called kind of grouped under the heading mindfulness, and Mike certainly talks about mindfulness. Okay, so what have I talked about? I've talked about organisational resilience. So in a nutshell, organisational resilience is the recognition that not everything can be planned for, a culture of emphasising being active and determined in the face of the unexpected, empowerment of people to act at a situated level, development of capabilities to notice, interpret and prepare for the unexpected being uncertainty, and 5, find ways to contain and recover from uncertainty. In essence, what I'll be doing is covering all this over the rest of the module. Okay, so some takeaway points for you at the end of this session. Resilience is a system capability. It's about understanding that organisations are systems and that a capability of those systems will be resilience. Without that capability, organisations are brittle. Systems are capable of easy collapse. Resilience can be understood in many different contexts: ecological, engineering, personal and social. Resilience is a process. Think about the adaptive model I talked about earlier, that figure of 8 curve. It's a process which is potentially continuous until at some point the process is destroyed, interrupted to such a point that it can't recover. Organisational resilience is not just about disasters. It's a continuous process of adaptation and change. Key theories for resilience are normal accident theory and HRO theory, and these are allied. They interact. But the most important one for the point of view of this module is high reliability organisational theory. Next time we're going to talk about Challenger and then Columbia and the relationship between Challenger and Columbia in NASA, 2 disasters which happened to the Space Shuttle program.